Welcome to Vows of Iron, Viking historical fiction, written by Bjorn Wolfe, narrated by R.K. Marks. Copyright 2023 by brooksaudiobooks.com and Shadowplay Communications, LLC. All rights reserved. No portion of this book may be reproduced in any form without written permission from the publisher or author. Visit brooksaudiobooks.com for updates on the availability of new books and a special free offer. Book 1, Chapter 1. In the fiery glow that illuminated the center of the hall, the ancient pillars of the high seat were bathed in a vivid light that contrasted sharply against the smoky darkness that enveloped the room beyond. Carved figures of the gods danced and shifted on the surface of the pillars, their grotesque shapes coming to life as the flames flickered and danced. Seated upon the broad seat between the pillars was Magnus, a weathered warrior with a formidable presence. The dragon-like carvings that adorned the back of his seat loomed menacingly behind him, while a great drinking horn sat at his side, a symbol of his strength and power. Magnus sat in silence, his coarse fingers buried deep in his unruly white beard, lost in thought as he stared out into the hall. Across the fire, on the other side of the room, sat Magnus's men-servants at a round table. They spoke only in hushed whispers, casting frequent, apprehensive glances towards their lord. Magnus's stillness and the blank look in his eyes unnerved them, prompting a sense of unease to seize the hall. Even the clattering of beer mugs could not break the oppressive silence that hung in the air. At the end of the hall, on a raised platform, a group of women sat spinning and carding wool in complete silence. Even the rustle of their movements was barely audible. They were the only occupants of the hall who did not seem affected by the weight of the oppressive atmosphere. The only one who appeared at ease amid the hall's tense atmosphere was a young boy, barely 14, who sat on the other side of the fire facing the high seat. He sat pensively, content to let his thoughts wander as he gazed from his father to the pillars of the seat. His slight frame and youthful features were a stark juxtaposition to the grizzled warriors around him. His skin was smooth, unblemished as a maiden's, and a cascade of bright yellow hair flowed down his neck in luscious waves. His countenance remained calm, an odd expression decorating his face. The mouth beneath his straight nose was tightly shut, exuding composure. His blue eyes gazed out into the distance, tranquil and fixated. The figure in question was Harold, the offspring of Magnus. Such moments of reflection were a common occurrence, often taking place during the evening hours. Harold found himself drawn to the pillars supporting the high seat, their presence reminiscent of life in the ruddy glow of the dying flames. During the daytime, the pillars appeared stagnant and lifeless, as if the gods infusing them with vitality had taken temporary residence elsewhere. Harold was unsure of their habits, where they went, or what they did, for they seemed to have a reckless nature. The pillars remained silent during daylight hours, reanimated only after dusk had fallen. As shadows crept across their intricate engravings, the pillars awakened. Their rebirth was treacherously deceptive, like an ill-tempered waking. The gods, if they had returned, seemed discontent, and Harold was always uneasy remaining in the hall in the twilight before the lighting of the fire. He felt their ire gathering like a sinister mist, unsure of their true intentions. He knew all too well that when the gods were in bad humor, it would be wise to keep one's distance, always respectful. After the fire was lit, the hall became a place of welcome warmth and light, the crackling flames merrily chatting with the gods who gradually became more cordial, their demeanor loosening. The fire's glow cast a watchful eye, spreading its warmth, banishing the shadows and giving them a newfound benevolence. The gods returned Harold's smile, a sign that their displeasure had ebbed and their good temper had once again been restored. As Harold sat quietly, he looked at the images carved onto the pillars. They were the house gods, the ones he and his family had grown up with. While the gods in the temple were grand and adorned with valuable metals, they seemed distant and almost too holy to approach. It took great courage to even try to get close to them, but the house gods were different. They were friends, companions, and a vital part of the family. They were quiet and peaceful, making no demands, and yet they were the center around which everything else in the home revolved. Harold had known them all his life, and he considered them to be his and his family's confidants. They had grown dark brown with age, almost black, and they felt hard as stones. But no one knew how old they really were. They had belonged to the family for generations, passing down from father to eldest son. As Harold sat near them, he could feel the weight of their age and their importance to his family. They were the visible sign of his family's continuance,
and he felt comforted by their presence. He knew that he could rely on them, and that they would always be there for him. On the right side of the throne stood the pillar dedicated to Sigfather, the All-Father. He was the age-old and wise deity with one eye. On his broad shoulders, his ravens, Hugin and Mugin, perched and whispered all manner of knowledge and wisdom into his ear. The birds were privy to all, including the past and the future, and Sigfather was always prepared for whatever came his way. As the leader of the gods, Sigfather was the most important ally to have. His rightful place was on the right side of the high seat, and that was where the pillar stood. On the left side was the pillar of Asgard, the wielder of the hammer, the giant slayer, and the master of thunder. Age Asgard was a proud figure, standing with his legs spread wide apart. His powerful arm was raised, ready to strike, and in his massive hand he held the mighty Mjolnir hammer. In the chief seat, sitting on the brown, weathered plank, was Magnus, Harald's father. Nothing changed in that spot except for the cushions and the sitters. Magnus sat there every evening, surrounded by his people who occupied lower tables from where they could look up to the chief seat. The old man would stroke his thick white beard with weather-tanned fingers, speaking words of wisdom or just being silent. Regularly, he would sit with the chief guest, cheerful and comfortable next to his gods. Although Magnus was not one to raise his voice, but when he did, he was weighty, and everyone would turn to listen. His voice filled the hall, reminiscent of ringing tones. In such moments, Harald couldn't help but notice how much he resembled Asgard with his powerful clenched fists over his head. However, when Magnus sat silent and meditated, he reminded Harald of Sigfather, except for the two eyes. The chief seat was Magnus's most comfortable place, and there he sat as the friendly and exemplary figure amidst his ancestors. B.J. Magnussolf, his grandfather, had once perched in the same spot, with his brother Rold. They had to abandon their family estate in Telemarken for having slain a man. His father, Romund Greipson, had also sat there before him, an equally strong-willed figure whose name people revered even after passing on. In time he would sit there himself, and after him his son and his son's son, generation after generation, family after family, until the earth vanished. The mere thought of his father's passing made his cheeks flush. He knew he had a responsibility to uphold, one he had long ago accepted with honor, but one that also filled him with both joy and apprehension. It was this knowledge that gave him a composure beyond his years. His mother, whom he only vaguely remembered, had instilled in him the family's unbroken traditions. He had imbibed it with her milk, and even before his bones had hardened, he understood that his life was only partly his own. He knew the honor of the dead, and the unbending Magnus was committed to his hand. For a man without honor cast shadows on two sides. Both his ancestors and his descendants had a claim on him, the claim of honor. He had no intention of disappointing anyone, least of all himself. As the hall grew quiet, the crackling of the fire was the only sound. Suddenly, tramping steps outside entered the hall, and Magnus was instantly wide awake. All sat still, listening as a knock sounded at the door. Magnus gestured to the porter who opened the door, revealing Gunnar, Magnus's kinsman, followed by his son, Hardanger, and some servants. The peace and quiet of the hall was suddenly interrupted. Magnus rose with a dignified air and left the high seat to meet his relative. His ceremonious, "Welcome, cousin," sounded cheerful and hearty. Harald, his son, ran around the seats to greet Hardanger, his junior by 2 years, with a kiss and genuine warmth. Magnus laid his hands heavily on Gunnar's shoulders, a somber expression on his face. "I was sure you'd come, cousin," he said. Gunnar replied seriously, "Such important news should be looked into. We have had prosperous though checkered years. What will happen now?" Magnus answered gloomily, "The good times are past. I guess what will happen. Follow me to the high seat, cousin." Magnus seated Gunnar at his side and called for fresh beer. They drank to each other with deep draughts. When Gunnar had sucked his beard dry, he turned to Magnus and asked, "Do you think there will be trouble in the country?" Magnus spoke slowly and solemnly. "Trouble there will be. After peace and prosperous years follow hard times. We have had the good times. Now we shall have to face the bad. Only it may be that the struggle will not reach these lands. We're getting old, Gunnar. Our swords are rusty, our arms stiff, and our sons are at the worst age possible, old enough to entangle themselves in difficulties, not old enough to manage them." Gunnar said, "I see that you cherish fears for the future, cousin. What do you advise?" "I advise that you stay here with Hardanger, and as many of your servants as can be safely spared from home. We should be prepared for everything. In times like these, most unexpected things can happen. I will follow your advice, as I've always done. Do you think of seeking light on the future from the gods? One should not trouble the gods before necessity demands it, but we should offer them sacrifices diligently and without stint. It had only been a week since Gunnar and Hardanger had driven home from the winter festival at Magnus's, but for Harold and Hardanger it had been a long week. They had found it difficult to be apart. They had a cushion drawn up to the fire and lay there on their stomachs right opposite each other, each with a host of things to ask about and report. Hardanger was a tall, loose-knit fellow with a long, bony face, browned with freckles and discoloured by wind and weather. He had a large nose and a broad mouth with thick lips. The expression of his sparkling grey eyes changed suddenly, and constantly shifted from close attention to distant dreaminess, from icy coldness to beaming warmth. Red curly hair hung in long locks down both sides of his smiling face. After the important news had been shared, he could no longer hold his tongue. With a mischievous glint in his eyes, he leaned forward and asked in a low voice, "Hey, Harold, did your gods feast on Yule meat?" Harold visibly bristled with annoyance. His smile vanished, and his face contorted with a vexed solemnity. He anxiously scanned the area, relieved to discover they were alone. Without responding, he shot Hardanger a withering glare. Hardanger chuckled contentedly and, with cupped hands, whispered again, "Your gods are bloated and overfed animals." He laughed so hard his belly shook, thoroughly enjoying Harold's mounting ire. And what kind of gods are they? One is an old, one-eyed wretch who needs ravens to impart wisdom, and the other is a boastful fool who can only afford goats because he doesn't have a horse. Harold's fists clenched, and he pressed his chin hard against his whitening knuckles. "Watch your words, Hardanger," he warned through gritted teeth. But Hardanger merely laughed harder than before, then abruptly stood up. Standing beside them was Astrid, Harold's sister, a delicate young woman with long pale blonde hair, sparkling blue eyes, a diminutive face, and a cheerful grin on her childish lips. Hardanger, clearly delighted to reunite with his same-age friend, embraced her and greeted her with a kiss. But he suddenly released her, reddening and feeling bashful. In his embarrassment, he began kicking at the burning logs. Astrid observed his antics with a serene, amused expression. "You're scorching your boots, Hardanger," she said, giggling softly. He straightened up, faced her, and gazed at her with a tender smile. Her smile quelled his awkwardness, and just like that, he felt like himself again. Beaming, he grabbed her hands and swung her arms apart. "I almost forgot to give you greetings from the cat and old Bjorn. The cat caught a ton of mice during Yuletide and got so fat and lazy, much like old Bjorn, though she hates being told as much." "Surely you didn't tell her that," Astrid teased. "I couldn't help myself. Once I saw it, I had to say it," he admitted with a grin. "You should be ashamed of yourself, Hardanger. Have you forgotten how old Bjorn has been kind to you since you lost your mother, and how many stories she's told us?" scolded Astrid. "I can make up better stories myself. Old wives' tales are too long and boring," replied Hardanger quickly, trying to hide the guilt he felt. "Do you really think she just makes them up?" asked Astrid curiously. "She talks about gods, trolls, and giants as if they were real. I suppose the other tales are lies too," sneered Hardanger. "You're a foolish boy. How do you know trolls and giants don't exist?" retorted Astrid. "Well, you never see them," shrugged Hardanger. Astrid changed the subject. "Aren't you going back to Hardanger now?" "I hope to stay here for the rest of winter and all summer," replied Hardanger. They fell silent, content to be in each other's company. Suddenly, Astrid noticed Harold hadn't spoken and was depressed. She knelt beside him and peered into his face. Harold avoided her eyes, but she knew something was wrong. Astrid looked at Hardanger pointedly. "You've upset Harold again, haven't you?" she said in reproach. Hardanger shifted uncomfortably, but tried to laugh it off. When that didn't work, he whispered to Astrid, "I shouldn't have to pretend to believe in your gods. You know I don't. But you shouldn't mock them either. It hurts Harold's feelings," Astrid whispered back, her voice angry. Harold lifted his head and spoke softly. "It's not just that. It's that the gods will one day take vengeance on you for your mockery, Hardanger," he said sadly. "When I don't believe in their gods, you can't expect me to tremble at their wrath," declared Hardanger, defiantly but calm. He kept his eyes on the ground, his face creased with discontent and annoyance. "You can say what you want in response," he continued. "Why can't I say what I want? I can't stand their gods, and I can't bear that you believe in them either. But since you hold them in such high regard, I'll hold my tongue. Yes, You say that now, snapped Astrid. Come tomorrow, you'll have forgotten all about it. What can I do about my forgetfulness? I'll make the same promise tomorrow, Hardanger quipped. The two sat in silence, moods sour. It wasn't until Astrid took Hardanger's hand that he perked up. He sat up straight, making a spot for her next to him. A smile graced his features, and any ill feelings faded away. Before long, all three huddled together, divulging secrets. The great hall roared with chatter and the heavy aroma of ale. The flames burned bright, and the images of the gods carved into the pillars observed everything with serenity and wisdom, patiently awaiting what was to come. Chapter 2. A few months later, the two boys were racing across the open moor. Dusk was settling in, the day crisp with biting cold, dark storm clouds gathering on the horizon. The small patch of blue sky above the heath was steadily shrinking, foretelling an imminent tempest. The moon, pallid and faint, was threatened to be swallowed by banks of clouds. At sunset, the sun rested on a golden mountain top of puffy clouds. The cousins were making their way back from a visit to their friends Hafnarfjordur, Hedmark, and Hjörungavag, the sons of Atle Knud from Gudvangen. Though the brothers were a little older than Harold, the youngest brother, Hjörungavag, was his age. At the annual feast in Gudvangen the previous year, the cousins had met and befriended Atle's sons, whom they now visited regularly. However, Hardanger was not as invested in the friendship as Harold was. The land remained peaceful, and they had sought permission to journey back to Gudvangen that winter, but under the condition of exercising caution, staying on the main roads, and returning home at the slightest hint of danger. They had promised to behave with decorum, given their family lineage. Today was the first time the cousins broke their vow. Hardanger pushed Harold to take a shortcut across the heath, accusing him of cowardice, and Harold, incensed by the taunt, agreed. Hardanger, always one for adventure, was also consumed by ardent homesickness to see Astrid before dusk, which he felt he would only achieve by taking the shortcut. As they galloped across the heath, their striking cloaks, which were pinned at the chest with silver clasps, and their helmet-like caps, failed to restrain their flowing hair, Hardanger's being a deep red, and Harold's a bright yellow. Hardanger rode recklessly, without a worry, living in the present moment. He rode with all his limbs and with his entire being. Harold rode alongside his cousin, his body perfectly still as if moulded from the same clay as his horse. In contrast, Hardanger's body flitted and fluttered, his reins and legs in constant motion. Harold watched him out of the corner of his eye, a small smile crossing his lips. "You ride like a fluttering chicken, Hardanger!" Harold shouted, breaking the silence between them. Hardanger shot him a quick glance, but was not at a loss for words. "And you sit your horse like an old idle cousin," came his quick retort. Their horses bounded forward, their heads capped with frost and their breath visible in the frigid air. Foam flew from their mouths in yellow flakes, and the snow and ice they kicked up pelted the riders' ears. Hardanger let out a wild whoop of exhilaration, but Harold remained silent, his mind clouded with displeasure. Despite his mood, the thrill of the ride was not lost on Harold. The pounding of hooves against the hard, frozen ground was music to his ears, and the power of the horses beneath him was intoxicating. The sun began to sink below the horizon, casting long, surreal shadows over the unbroken expanse of white. Hardanger suddenly started to laugh, pointing to the shadows and urging Harold to join in his mirth. But Hardanger's laughter was too wild, too uncontrolled, leaving no room for Harold to feel amused. His irritation began to bubble up, and soon he was no longer lost in the simple pleasure of the ride. Harold's mind started to quicken, his thoughts and emotions following suit. The primal thrill of the ride was giving way to reason. Hardanger rode blissfully unaware of the gathering storm and the dangers of getting lost on the heath. Harold, riding beside him, tried to resist the anger welling up in him, but it was too late. Hardanger's joy only fueled the flames of Harold's resentment. Why did Hardanger always cause him problems? Why did he have to bear all the inconvenience just because Hardanger refused to be inconvenienced? Harold had always been too yielding towards Hardanger, and now he was paying the price. As they rode, Harold's anger was fueled by memories of Hardanger's faults and failings. Did he not remember the gash from Hjörungavag's knife that he carried in his coat? Harold had saved him from certain death when he acted quickly and held on tight. Yet Hardanger seemed to forget it all, riding without a care in the world. The storm was coming, but Hardanger was blinded by his happiness. Harold could feel the anger boiling inside of him, distorting his perception and making him see only Hardanger's weaknesses. It was all his fault, but he realized it too late. His mental stability was slipping away, and he was powerless to stop it. Hardanger's joy only seemed to make it worse. They rode on, oblivious to the danger around them, Hardanger happy and carefree, and Harold consumed by anger and resentment. It was a recipe for disaster, and soon they would both pay the price. Such was Hardanger, a wild and foolish child, a forgetful and ungrateful brute. He simply couldn't play nice with Atla's sons, always causing trouble and never showing his true colors. Even though Hjörungavag was older, Hardanger refused to give him any respect or deference. They brawled like wolf cubs, the fury of their youth fueling their anger. But each time they fought, Hafnarfjordur would bring them back together, and each time Hardanger made empty promises to behave better. Yet those promises were as fleeting as snow in a storm. Hardanger was a humbug, unreliable and impossible to understand. When Hjörungavag gave him a knife he had almost been killed with, Hardanger couldn't even be thankful. Instead, he flaunted his valuable money belt and only made things worse. They were destined to continue their fiery conflict, and someday it would lead to serious enmity between them, maybe even a feud with Atla's sons. Harold couldn't help but think that it might end in murder and bloodshed, just like their grandfathers had experienced. They could even be exiled from Drammen, just like their ancestors had to flee Telemarken. Harold's anger towards Hardanger only grew as they rode on, side by side, in tense silence. He blamed Hardanger for everything, unable to bear the weight of his own disobedience. And even though the riders had slowed their pace, Harold's anger burned hotter than ever before. He was not surprised by Harold's sudden outburst of anger. Harold was known for his ability to maintain composure in the most heated situations, but also for his tendency to become irate at the most peculiar times. Hardanger was puzzled about why he deserved Harold's wrath at that moment more than he had before. He had done nothing to disrespect the gods, and just a moment ago he had been in good spirits. Though curious about the reason behind Harold's anger, Hardanger decided it was not wise to aggravate him further by speaking. Instead, he hoped that remaining silent would eventually soothe Harold's temper. After all, Harold couldn't stay angry forever. However, the unpleasantness ruined the enjoyment of the ride. They rode at a fast pace while Hardanger kept his tongue tied. The silence that surrounded them was not something he was accustomed to. It overwhelmed him, extinguishing all traces of his humor. But they were coming home soon. The feeling of weariness crept over him, making him feel restless. A storm might be brewing, but he was too reckless to care. As they approached the forest, the ride seemed to stretch on forever. He couldn't fathom why the forest was barring their path to the valley. If there wasn't a forest, they could easily be home by nightfall. If only the horses had long legs like their shadows in the snow, they could gallop over the forest with ease. Instead, they were miserable, short-legged creatures. The entire evening was going wrong. Harold was riding with a chip on his shoulder, making it impossible to have a conversation with him. Why hadn't they brought food? Suddenly Hardanger's stomach growled so loudly that he could almost taste the flavor of roast meat. He craved meat and bread and beer. The more he focused on his hunger, the more he yearned for something to fill the void inside him. Why couldn't they just ride through the woods and get some food? Finally, he couldn't resist the temptation and forgot all about his caution. In his innocence, he turned towards Harold and said, "I know a path through the forest." It came out of him like a sudden burst of inspiration, but those familiar with Hardanger could hear the insincerity in his voice. Harold saw right through him. Hardanger wasn't content with the damage he'd already done. Harold glared at him, a mix of anger and disbelief on his face. "You really think so?" Harold replied in a cool, detached tone. "Then I suggest we take a shortcut through the woods." Hardanger hesitated, unsure of the path through the woods. He had gotten lost in there once before, and it had taken him a long time to find his way out. But the idea of exploring the unknown appealed to him more than staying in one place for too long. With the two of them together, they could easily find their way through the woods. It wouldn't be impossible, just a little difficult. With a gentle and agreeable voice, Hardanger suggested they give it a try, hoping to hide his true intentions. "I'm not in the mood for any foolishness today," Harold replied firmly. Hardanger felt like he had been slapped in the face. Harold's words stung him to his core. Fear and anger writhed inside him like a coiled snake. He turned his horse and galloped towards the woods, wanting nothing more than to get away from Harold and prove him wrong. As Harold watched Hardanger ride away, his anger began to fade. He knew he had pushed Hardanger too far, but he didn't expect him to react so strongly. That was unnecessary, he thought to himself, feeling guilty. He hoped Hardanger would come to his senses and turn back, but he couldn't be sure. He couldn't shake off the guilt and the nagging feeling that he had done something wrong. The will to turn back had taken root in Harold, but the soil was too rocky to nurture. The opportunity had slipped away, and Hardanger continued without him. Harold remained frozen in place, unable to follow his friend. The thought of being separated for life gnawed at him, a ridiculous notion that could not come to pass. No, he would not allow it, but the weight of righteousness was a heavy burden to bear. He knew he was in the right, and Hardanger was wrong. The knowledge was too strong to ignore, making it impossible for him to turn his horse around. The words echoed in his mind once more. It must not happen, an affirmation of his will to not be separated from Hardanger. Still, he rode on, letting it happen. The distance between them growing, and Harold's heart was heavy with the knowledge that his chance to reconcile was slipping away. Chapter 3. Harold continued his journey, but as the sun drifted below the horizon, a chilling wind swept in from the north. It brought with it clouds of ice-cold snow so fine it was like sand. Harold could barely even see the wood in front of him, and Hardanger was long gone, consumed by the sea of snow. The night crept in, and a faint glow in the sky revealed the presence of a full moon above. Harold used the moon and the wind to guide himself, feeling more isolated and forsaken than he ever had before. The weight of his loneliness, desolation, and sense of accusation and guilt bore down on him. It was as if he had shrunk in size since Hardanger's departure. An uneasy dissatisfaction gnawed at his mind like hunger. He was displeased with himself and also with Hardanger, though he felt more responsible for the two of them as the elder. He grew seriously anxious for Hardanger, as he didn't know the safe path through the wood, having lost himself in it before. With the bitter cold he was in great danger of freezing to death or falling prey to wolves. Harold was beside himself with despair. Was it even worth continuing his search for Hardanger? It was too late now, and the thought filled him with remorse like an avalanche. In defense, he tried to reason that it was Hardanger's own fault. He rode over the heath against his better judgment, and it was he who chose to enter the wood. If death took him, Hardanger had only himself to blame. But these thoughts brought him no comfort, and Harold soon realized the blame may have been misplaced. He shouldn't have allowed himself to be persuaded to ride over the heath, breaking his word. His anger toward Hardanger was unjustified, especially since he knew how susceptible he was to emotion. It was his anger that drove Hardanger to the wood and put them both in this perilous situation. If one knew how to handle him, Hardanger was not an unreasonable fellow. With the right mix of good humor and friendly chat, his mind could be turned in any direction one desired. But cross him and Hardanger would become doubly furious, even if the fault was his own. Sensibility would escape him once he felt irritated, and even when Hardanger was in the wrong, being right didn't make him any easier to deal with. He was just so full of rashness and foolishness that it was effortless to be right against him. Yet that never granted any relief. Hardanger wasn't resolved that easily. With Hardanger in the equation, there always seemed to be something unresolved. Harold rode on. He paid no attention to the moon's light or the wind's direction. His thoughts were consumed by his guilt and mounting remorse. Hardanger was all that filled his mind. How was he? How would he do? Harold tried to convince himself that Hardanger knew the woods well, and that he would find his friend's horse safe at home upon his arrival. It was only wishful thinking, though. Hardanger's voice was too sincere to hide any lies. Harold was at a loss for what to do. He had lost his closest companion, and it was all his own doing. Even if by some miracle he found Hardanger home again, things wouldn't be the same. They wouldn't be friends any longer. Yet Hardanger was just like himself. Since they were young lads, they couldn't do without each other. Harold couldn't wrap his head around it all. He didn't understand how this could happen. They were friends only yesterday, and now Harold rode alone in the snowstorm and the night, while Hardanger was lost in the woods. His struggle to keep his tears from falling was in vain. Harold didn't know what to do next. He was riding aimlessly, having lost his dearest friend, and it was all his fault. Hardanger had deserted him because he could not control his temper. Harold felt a deep sense of loss at Hardanger's departure. Hardanger had been the one person he could rely on in life and death. The realization of the power of anger and cruel words to tear apart a friendship had sobered him. He vowed to never let his anger get the better of him again. But this did not bring his friend back. There was little doubt that Hardanger was lost in the woods. He would never take the reasonable route and stick to the edge of the forest. Hardanger was fearless, almost reckless, and this was part of what made him so loved. His sister, Astrid, had taken a liking to Hardanger, and his absence had left her anxious and uneasy. He couldn't bear the thought of returning home without his friend. Despite his loss and confusion, Harold rode on. He had no idea where he was or where he was going. Without Hardanger, he couldn't bring himself to go home. Hardanger was still on his mind, and he wondered if he would ever see his friend again. Hardanger was a character of complexity and unpredictability. Harold had known since childhood that Hardanger was unmanageable, and all the troubles he had faced were brought on by him. Astrid had to intervene in numerous fights and disagreements between the two of them. Hardanger was not the most amiable comrade. He brought nothing but change and adventure, and one was always on edge in his presence. However, despite all his quirks, Harold couldn't help but miss him whenever he wasn't around. As Harold rode his horse towards Ranger, he realized that it was wandering off course. With Hardanger gone, it didn't matter where he went. The cold penetrated Harold's cape, and he couldn't help but feel frozen and shivery. But there was something comforting about the cold. It distracted him from thinking about Hardanger. Harold had always been frustrated with Hardanger's odd behavior and didn't understand why he couldn't be like everyone else. But now he knew that he wouldn't want Hardanger to change. Hardanger was who he was, a quirky and unpredictable friend. Despite all their disagreements, the friendship between them was not over. If they ever crossed paths again, they would reconcile and be friends once more. Hardanger was a skilled and daring skier, always pushing himself to try new and challenging feats, regardless of how many times he fell in the process. He was not one for learning from experience, and that was just who he was. Hardanger, a true original. He was known for his daring, but Hardanger had never experienced a serious mishap. When challenged by Harold for his reckless behavior, Hardanger would simply retort that he trusted his luck only for as long as destiny permitted. He did not care to know where his threshold lay. This may have aggravated Harold, but it was pointless to argue. Hardanger had a knack for winding up in dire predicaments, yet he always managed to escape unscathed. His audacity likely resulted from his unbounded irrationality. Had he been only a little unreasonable, he would not have survived past his 12th birthday. But he was so utterly illogical that the just recompense that befell Harold and others could never locate Hardanger. Harold couldn't fathom it. There was the notorious incident with the bear, for example. It happened a year back, but Harold could not forget it even if he tried. Stories of a bear's den atop a nearby heath had been circulating around the village. They only knew that it nestled between two hills and resolved to discover it. The thought of the den consumed both of them, but Harold was willing to wait and bide his time. In contrast, Hardanger's yearning was insatiable and boundless. "If you won't come, I'll go alone," he proclaimed. Harold reluctantly followed. They set out in late summer, trekking through vast distances, without encountering any hills or bear dens. Instead, they stumbled upon a hillside blanketed with luscious bilberries. Harold distinctly heard an inner voice screaming, "Bilberries! Bilberries!" It was evident that Hardanger had heard it too. Crouching low to the ground, they reached out with both hands and collected bilberries, popping the small, tart fruits into their mouths without hesitation. Suddenly they noticed a bear feasting on the same berries just opposite them. Harold froze, eyes glued to the bear's blue snout before common sense kicked in, and he took off running as fast as he possibly could. He had run a long way when he realized that his companion, Hardanger, was not with him, and that he wasn't being pursued by the bear. He stopped and looked around, expecting the worst. When he turned back to look at the bilberry slope, he saw a sight that filled him with a different kind of terror. Hardanger was standing face to face with the bear, the two of them baring their teeth at each other. Harold was thunderstruck. Why wasn't the bear attacking Hardanger and devouring him on the spot? He couldn't understand it. To him, the only logical outcome was that the bear would see his friend as an even tastier bilberry picker and pounce. He stood rooted to the spot, mouth agape, as the minutes ticked by. It felt like an eternity before the bear finally slinked off, sneaking away without making any sudden movements. Hardanger went back to collecting bilberries as if nothing had happened. Harold was completely baffled by what he had just witnessed. He couldn't wrap his mind around why the bear didn't attack Hardanger. He convinced himself that he was dreaming until he trudged his way back to his friend and realized that everything was very much real. Harold stared at him incredulously for a while before finally spitting out the question that had been gnawing at him. "Why didn't you run?" "Do you think you can outrun a bear?" Hardanger responded calmly. "What would be the point of trying? No, you have to show them that you're not afraid. When I stopped being scared, the bear got bored and left. It's as simple as that." As much as Harold tried, he couldn't understand his friend's way of thinking. How could someone be so at ease around such a dangerous creature? How could he face down a grizzly and come out unscathed? Hardanger was an enigma, and Harold knew that he could never truly grasp what made him tick. Harold shook his head in deep contemplation, lost in a memory that he relived over and over again. The incident with the bear was not the only adventure they had that summer. Another memory resurfaced, a memory he needed to occupy his mind with, yet he couldn't avoid the fear that consumed him. Was Hardanger being hunted by wolves at that very moment? That summer, they both decided to learn how to swim. They didn't have anyone to teach them, but Hardanger was determined. He had watched one of Magnus's servants, a good swimmer, and learned the basic arm and leg movements required to stay afloat. Harold watched as Hardanger lay across a wooden plank, demonstrating the strokes needed. It didn't look difficult, but the thought of sinking was terrifying. Hardanger was persistent in his encouragement, explaining that it was easy. "Just scoop the water with your arms and kick with your legs," he said. Finally they went down to the fjord. On the way, Harold made Hardanger promise that they wouldn't go too far from the shore. Hardanger agreed and swore that they wouldn't. Once they arrived, Hardanger stripped down, basking in the sun. Harold stood hesitantly, still fully clothed. After a bit of prodding, Hardanger impatiently gave up and ran to a rock, flung his arms over his head, launched himself off and began to swim away. Harold's heart raced as he stood at the edge of the rock, still fully clothed. There, down below, lay Hardanger, swallowed up by the water. Harold watched as he struggled, arms and legs flailing about. Hardanger's head bobbed up for a moment, but then the water pulled him back under. A paralyzing fear took hold of Harold as he stood there, completely helpless. His body felt heavy, weighed down by the terror that had seized him. But then something shifted within him, and he began to shiver uncontrollably. He forgot his own lack of swimming skills, and knew that he had to do something to help Hardanger. As he was about to plunge into the water fully clothed, he watched in amazement as Hardanger suddenly popped back up to the surface. He spat and cursed, relieved and angry at the same time. Harold couldn't help but laugh at the sight of Hardanger's ridiculous swimming technique. Rather than using conventional swimming strokes, Hardanger simply crawled through the water with a long stroke. It was a sight to behold, and Harold couldn't believe that this was the same man who just moments before had been drowning. Hardanger waded to shore, laughing and coughing up water. He teased Harold for still being dressed, but his relief at being alive was palpable. He took one more plunge into the water before they both headed back to shore. As they walked away from the water's edge, Hardanger looked back at the lake and shook his head in disbelief. "Who would have thought swimming could be so difficult?" he mused. "If I hadn't just happened to think of how dogs swim, I might not be here to tell the tale." Such was Hardanger, a man with seemingly endless strength and resilience. He was impervious to danger and the elements, and even the fiercest bears cowered in his presence. But could he survive being lost in the woods and freezing to death? It was not impossible, but Harold clung to the hope that Hardanger's indomitable spirit would see him through. Harold's mind wandered as he rode aimlessly through the snowy landscape, hoping to stumble upon some sign of his friend. He envisioned Hardanger crashing through the treacherous woods, emerging victorious and unscathed. The thought of him already being safe in his own bed brought a glimmer of hope to Harold's heart. Suddenly his horse came to a halt, signaling that they had arrived home. Though stiff and numb from the cold, Harold rushed to the stable's entrance, desperate to know if Hardanger had arrived before him. He inspected each horse, searching for any signs of his friend's horse. But it was not there. The disappointment hit Harold like a ton of bricks. He knew that Hardanger was still out there, lost and alone in the wilderness. His heart ached at the thought of his friend lying in the snow, arms and legs stretched out, completely covered by the drifting snow, his loyal horse by his side, silently standing vigil. But Harold wouldn't give up hope. He refused to believe that it was over for Hardanger. He shut the stable door and strode resolutely towards the courtyard. Though hunger gnawed at his belly and the cold bit at his skin, his feverish determination drove him on. For the sake of his friend, he would not rest until he found him. He stepped into the weathered outhouse, fingers numb with cold. The skis were stashed inside, waiting for him and Hardanger. With practiced ease, he located his own pair and then Hardanger's. He cracked the door open just a bit and whistled a soft tune for his beloved dog. The animal's tail wagged wildly in response, its fluffy body bouncing about with excitement. The warmth of the dog's tongue on his frosty hands was a welcome sensation as he laced up his snowshoes with stiff fingers. There was no time to waste. As soon as he was suited up, he headed out into the chilly night, retracing his earlier steps. The wind had picked up, biting his cheeks ruthlessly. The moon cast an eerie glow over the snow, guiding him forward. The mission was clear: find Hardanger. He couldn't return home empty-handed. The stakes were too high. Chapter 4. Hardanger rode furiously through the snowstorm, his mind consumed with anger and defiance. He didn't have a reasonable thought in his head, only the instinct to keep riding. The motion of his horse cooled his irritation, and he found solace in the wild, chaotic expanse of the wood. There was freedom in casting away the yoke of reason, a relief in knowing that his actions could mean life or death. Hardanger was determined to show Harold that he wasn't afraid of the wood, even though he didn't know any paths through it. He would prove that he was a true man, capable of facing any obstacle. The snowstorm raged against him, but he paid it no mind. A man intent on performing an exploit couldn't worry about a trifle like the weather. As he rode deeper into the wood, it occurred to Hardanger that he might get lost and never find his way out. But he couldn't give up now. He was convinced that riding through the wood was the worst thing he could do to Harold. If he succeeded, Harold would be mortified. If he failed, Harold would be grieved, and it would serve him right. Hardanger pushed on, driving himself harder and faster. The trees whistled and crackled around him, and he had to slow his pace. But nothing could stop him now. As he plunged deeper into the wood, he knew that he was risking everything, but he was willing to take that risk. He was a man, and he would face any challenge, no matter the cost. In the outskirts of the forest, Hardanger rode with great progress and confidence, convinced he would be the first to reach home. However, his mind was burdened with worry for Harold. He feared that Harold could be lost in the heath, with no guide to lead him back. Hardanger's confidence gave way to anxiety for his friend, and his anger dissipated. He considered chasing after Harold, to show him the advantages of riding through the woods. Yet he realized that Harold would interpret his actions as evidence that Hardanger was afraid to ride alone in the forest. Despite his reservations, Hardanger continued to move forward. But the deeper he ventured into the woods, the more challenging it became to navigate. His horse struggled to cope with the terrain, moving at an irregular pace. Hardanger had to maneuver around low branches and fallen trunks, slowing down his progress to a crawl. The dense parts of the woods were not pleasant, and Hardanger was wary of startling his horse with any loud noises, although he was not afraid. The eerie sounds of whistling, creaking, and groaning created a sense of emptiness and melancholy. Snow fell heavily from the branches with an audible thump, and the fluttering of wings unnerved him deeply. To make matters worse, the darkness was overwhelming. Hardanger could barely see the nearest tree trunks. He longed to be back on the heath in Harold's company, and wondered why he even decided to enter the woods. Hardanger grew increasingly disoriented and found himself lost. At last, he decided to give up trying to figure out any direction and continued blindly. He felt relieved to be free from the burden of decision-making. For now, the only concern was keeping warm, as that was becoming increasingly difficult. Hardanger was in an optimistic mood, and completely indifferent to any coming problems. He was mentally prepared to face any obstacles and confront his destiny. He had discarded all apprehensions and concerns, and was simply riding his horse without any pressure. If his horse kept going, he would continue on his journey regardless of the circumstances. He was confident that everything would eventually work out in his favor. He didn't know how it would happen, nor did he bother himself with such trivial thoughts. He had concluded that it was better if others took on any responsibilities than him. He wouldn't even dare to intervene for fear of losing his way in the storm. He left everything to fate, and relied on luck to pull him through. If he had to pay for his recklessness, he was ready to take that risk. He rode on for quite some time, but not as long as he had initially anticipated. When the snowstorm intensified, he slowed down, and the time that had elapsed seemed to have doubled. He was under the illusion that he was making good progress. However, he soon found himself going off track, half asleep on his horse. He mechanically controlled the horse with his arms and legs. As the horse gradually slowed down, he realized he needed to stay awake and keep it going. He was well aware of the dangers of sleeping in the cold. Therefore he summoned all his energy to keep himself alert and warm. Even so, his body was slowly succumbing to the cold. He knew his life was in peril, but still, he didn't lose hope, and continued to fight against the urge to sleep. He knew better than to give in to temptation, as it would prove fatal in the freezing storm. With a resolute mindset, Hardanger gathered his strength. The thought of giving up was simply not an option. 12 years, no matter how long, could not satiate his thirst for life. He was destined for greater things, like becoming a Viking and marrying Astrid. But the never-ending forest taunted him. Would it ever come to an end? Finally, after riding for what seemed like an eternity, Hardanger stumbled upon tracks from a horse. The horse had clearly been here before. But where exactly was he? The forest kept its secrets, leaving Hardanger lost and bewildered. He decided to follow the tracks in the hope of breaking the circle and finding his way out of the woods. At this point, simply getting out, no matter the direction, became his sole focus. He wouldn't allow his thoughts to deter him. Hardanger knew that overthinking would only lead to weakness. He pushed forward, courageously fighting against the bitter cold. Once again, Hardanger lost the trail. His horse became more reluctant to move on, only continuing under duress. Then, just when things seemed their bleakest, he found himself suddenly outside the woods. No more tree trunks, just whirling clouds of snow. But what next? Hardanger rode further in the hope of finding more trees, but there were none. He wondered which side of the forest he now found himself on. He mustered all his reasoning power and reflected on his memories. He remembered that the wind blew from the north, the direction from which he came. Thus he deduced that he must be on the same side he entered from. If only he could recognize the end of the woods, he would know which way to go. Should he turn back and try to navigate through the trees once more? No, he knew better than to risk getting lost in the tangled underbrush. Besides, he had lost all desire to venture into the woods. In fact, the horse had taken advantage of Hardanger's contemplative state and had come to a complete halt without him even realizing it. The horse was facing away from the raging storm, its head drooping down wearily. Hardanger attempted to stir the horse into motion again. They couldn't just stay there forever. But the horse had already made up its mind about the situation. It was staying put no matter what. Hardanger spent a lot of energy trying to coax the horse to move, pulling on its reins, striking it with his whip, but nothing seemed to work. The horse had reached its limit and beyond. It wasn't budging, and it intended to stay that way for as long as it saw fit. Hardanger dismounted and stared at his horse in disbelief. What was wrong with the creature? Had it suddenly grown a new sense of independence? He tugged at the reins, attempting to move the horse to one side, but it didn't budge. He lashed out with his whip, but that only made the horse sigh with disdain. It was content to stay put. Hardanger looked around in confusion, hoping for some sign to guide them, but nothing appeared to do the trick, so he tried a gentler approach. He spoke to it in a soft voice, rubbed its fur, and even sang to it in a high-pitched voice. He showered it with compliments and flattery. Then, with great difficulty, he climbed back onto its back, hoping it had changed its mind. Unfortunately, it hadn't. Hardanger tried to remain calm, patting its neck and trying to appeal to its better nature, but it was no use. He screamed with frustration and threw his entire body into it, but the horse still refused to budge. Hardanger was about to lose his cool when he tried to calm the horse again with gentle words, but it simply wouldn't cooperate. The horse had reached its limit and refused to budge any further, despite his attempts to coerce it. Frustrated and exhausted, he dismounted and assessed the situation. The snowstorm raged on, causing the biting wind to lash against his face and penetrate his clothing with icy cold. He knew that if he gave in to his weariness and the cold, he would succumb to danger. But he couldn't rely on the horse to carry him any further either. Its power and stamina were no match for the relentless storm and length of their journey. He only had a small amount of strength left to save himself. He clenched his fists tightly, gathering every ounce of physical and mental energy had left, as if extracting some hidden reserve from within himself. Yet it seemed like all the possibilities for escape had abandoned him. As he braced himself against the wind, he fought the creeping fear that he was doomed. Giving in was not an option. He had to remain upright and determined to keep his hope alive. His thoughts wandered to an image of a Yuletide feast from his past, the scent of blood and entrails filling the air. He recalled the hollow cavity of an ox's body after its organs had been removed. Without hesitation, he drew his knife and removed the horse's bridle. With trembling hands he found a spot on its neck and made a decisive thrust. The horse groaned and fell to its knees, its legs stiff and struggling. Hardanger rolled it over and made a cut in its neck, preparing to remove the windpipe and gullet when the time came. He knew it was a desperate act, but it was his only chance for survival. Blood sprayed into his eyes, blinding him for a moment until he could rub them clean. The metallic scent filled his nostrils, and the taste of it coated his tongue. With one swift slice from front to back, he opened the horse's stomach, and the warm, steaming organs spilled out. He pulled them out with his bare hands, wincing as the heat burned him, but not stopping until he had cleared the animal's insides. He cut through the diaphragm, extracting the lungs, before heaving a deep sigh and crawling inside the horse's empty carcass, growling with a sense of relief and shelter. He couldn't find any space for his legs, so he emerged again, wrapped his cloak around his lower limbs, and burrowed back into the animal's innards. The warmth surrounded him, and he felt a sense of comfort at the thought of sleeping through the storm. As he drifted off, he chuckled to himself about the possibility of living on frozen horse meat until the weather cleared. He was filled with an inner hope that his friend Harold would return soon. As he slept deeply and soundly, he felt confident that he would live to see another day. Chapter 5. Harold rode westward with the wind on his right side, gently pushing against him. He trudged up a gradual slope, steadily but not quickly. However, his body felt taut and energetic, and his consciousness of his own vitality transferred more strength to him. He strained with all his might, and was hell-bent on reaching Hardanger or dying trying. His will was unbreakable, and doubt and exhaustion couldn't get a foothold. For the time being, his goal was to circle the forest's perimeter, spotting evidence of Hardanger's tracks and where he had penetrated the trees. Harold's dog, if he could locate the horse's tracks, would be of great assistance. On the other hand, if he failed, the dog might be able to pick up the scent. That was Harold's strategy. Every now and then he glanced at his loyal dog, trotting behind him. The animal wore a disgruntled expression on its face as it walked by, and its tail dropped listlessly. It couldn't comprehend why they were undertaking this journey in such terrible weather, and at first had absolutely no interest in it. But as soon as Harold spoke to it affectionately, or it realized it was being watched, it brightened up and bounded forward, panting happily and chattering to him in dog-speak. Despite their tardiness, they continued on their way. Harold was pleased to notice the wind subsiding. The snow clouds gradually dispersed, and the moon's pale globe broke through against a blue backdrop. A white stretch surrounded him, abruptly interrupted by the wood's black boundary. There was no further upward climb. He travelled comfortably and quietly on his ski, scanning his surroundings. The retreating snow clouds revealed a broadening horizon. He had to be certain of his location. He now recognized his position and could map his way. He had reached the moor, and only needed to turn right and travel alongside the wood's rim. His snowshoes easily slid over the snowy plain's smooth, consistent surface, and he picked up pace after each step. A tense energy consumed Harold as he urged his dog forward with short, commanding shouts. He was on a mission, and he needed his loyal companion by his side. The dog understood, sensing its master's restlessness, and charged ahead with determined purpose. It zigzagged through the snow, occasionally pausing, but never quite coming to a complete stop. Harold's mental tension transferred to the animal, and they both surged forward with heightened fervor. Sweat streamed down Harold's face, but he dared not hold the dog back. At last, the dog stopped in its tracks and began circling around, snuffling with heightened excitement. Harold rushed up beside it, waiting with bated breath to see what it had found. The dog was on to something. It charged ahead towards the woods, but then stopped again as if uncertain. Harold felt his impatience grow, urging the dog on with a feverish intensity. And then, with a sudden jerk, the dog lifted its head and sniffed the air around it. It had found something, and the two charged forward together, ready for whatever awaited them in the unknown wilderness. Harold was certain now. This was the spot where he needed to enter the woods. The only thing left to do was take off his skis and walk. But as he approached the dog, it had already started moving away from the woods. Harold shouted at it, thinking it must be mistaken. The dog stood still, waiting for further direction. Harold called to it again, but it remained unmoving. A low whine escaped its lips. Harold tried to encourage it, and the dog began to move once more. Harold followed, staying at the edge of the woods, figuring the dog was still following the right track in the wrong direction. He thought it would realize its mistake and turn back soon enough. But the dog did not turn back. Instead, it stopped by a slight elevation in the snow and began to sniff around eagerly. It was clear the dog had found something important. Harold froze in place, mustering all his willpower not to collapse. Was Hardanger lying there? Had tragedy finally struck? It all seemed too much to bear. Harold couldn't move, struck in a vital nerve. How could he continue living if this was the end of the line? It occurred to him that his lineage would end here. Only he and Astrid remained, but with a stain on his honor for letting Hardanger ride to his death, Harold knew he needed to make a sacrifice to Sigfather to wash away his shame. And Astrid, she wouldn't survive without him. Harold's dreams and plans had been scattered like chaff before the wind.